The order was absolute. Advance to the Charlevoix Mill Road. Hold the position. Do not retreat. 554 men walked into the ravine. They walked right into the stomach of the German army, and then the jaws snapped shut. If you believe the stories of men who stood firm in the face of impossible odds deserve to be remembered, please consider subscribing. It was October 1918, the Argonne forest in France. The Great War was supposed to be ending, but the killing was at its peak. This was the Meuse-Argonne offensive, a massive push to break the German line. And deep in that dense, fog-choked forest, a single unit from the 77th Division was about to become a legend written in blood. They would be known as the Lost Battalion. But they weren't lost. They knew exactly where they were. It was the rest of the world that had abandoned them. Major Charles Whittlesey adjusted his round, wire-rimmed spectacles. He did not look like a war hero. He looked like what he was, a Wall Street lawyer from New York City. He was tall, thin, and intellectual. He commanded a mix of tough New York City gangsters, bartenders, and immigrants. They were loud, rough men. But as the sun began to set behind the jagged ridge, a heavy silence fell over the ravine. The trees around them were shredded. The ground was a churned soup of mud and decaying leaves. Whittlesey looked at his map. They had reached their objective. They had punched a hole in the German line. But when he looked to his left, there was no one. When he looked to his right, there was only the darkening forest. The French unit on their flank had stalled. The American unit on the other side had retreated. Whittlesey stood alone in the pocket. The air smelled of wet earth and rotting pine, but underneath it, the metallic tang of impending violence. He called for his runner. "Check the rear guard," Whittlesey said. His voice was calm, betraying nothing. The runner returned 10 minutes later. His face was pale, smeared with dirt. He didn't salute. He just stared at the major. "Sir," the soldier whispered, "there is no rear guard. They're gone. There's barbed wire across the road behind us." "Who put it there?" "Jerry did, sir. We're cut off." Whittlesey nodded once. He didn't scream. He didn't panic. He simply took a breath that tasted of cold fog. They were surrounded. A battalion of 500 men, trapped in a ravine no larger than a football field, with cliffs on both sides occupied by German machine gunners. The first night was a lesson in claustrophobia. The Germans knew they had the Americans in a kill box. Snipers positioned themselves high on the ridges. They didn't shoot to storm the position yet. They shot to terrorize. A man would try to dig a foxhole deeper, his shovel scraping a rock, and a single crack would echo through the valley. The man would slump forward. Silence would return. Whittlesey moved among the men. He didn't sleep. He walked the perimeter, his tall frame a silhouette in the gloom. He wrote in his logbook, the pencil shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the cold that seeped into their bones. "Situation serious," he wrote, "but the men are holding." By the second day, the real enemy arrived. Thirst. There was a stream at the bottom of the hill, but the German machine gunners had it dialed in. To crawl toward the water was suicide. Yet, the wounded were crying out. One private, a kid from the Bronx named Holtzman, looked at his canteen. It was dry. He looked at the stream, glimmering just 50 yards away. "I'm going," Holtzman rasped. "Don't be a fool," a sergeant hissed next to him. "They're watching the water." "I'd rather die drinking than die dry." Holtzman crawled out of the brush. He made it 10 yards, then 20. The forest held its breath. He reached the water's edge and dipped his canteen. The ridge lit up. 3 machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The water erupted in white sprays. Holtzman didn't even scream. He just collapsed into the mud, his canteen still empty. The message was clear. No water, no food, no escape. But the worst was yet to come. On the third day, a low rumble started from the south. The men in the foxholes lifted their heads. Hope surged through the ravine. It was the distinct, heavy thud of American artillery. Their boys were shelling the German ridge. The cavalry was clearing a path. "Keep your heads down," Whittlesey shouted. "Here comes the help." The whistling of the shells grew louder, closer, too close. The first explosion hit the center of the American perimeter. Dirt, tree limbs, and shrapnel sprayed into the air. Men screamed. Whittlesey froze. He looked up, his glasses spattered with mud. Another shell landed, then another. They weren't hitting the Germans. They were walking the barrage directly across the Lost Battalion. "It's our own guys!" someone screamed. "They're killing us!" Panic, raw and animalistic, threatened to break the line. Men were being torn apart by American steel. There was no radio. The telephone lines had been cut days ago. Whittlesey grabbed his signal officer. "The pigeons! Get the pigeons!" They had brought carrier pigeons, 3 of them. The first bird was released with a message to stop the shelling. It flew up, circled once, and was immediately blasted out of the sky by German fire. They released the second bird. It panicked, flew into a tree, and was cut down by a sniper. One bird remained. A black, speckled pigeon named Cher Ami. The artillery was relentless. The ground heaved like a dying beast. Trees were splintering, raining sharp wood down like arrows. If the shelling didn't stop in 5 minutes, there would be no battalion left to save. Whittlesey scribbled a note on a tiny piece of onion paper. His hand was steady, though the world was ending around him. "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." He folded the paper. He handed it to the signalman. They placed it in the canister on Cher Ami's leg. The soldier cupped the bird in his hands. "Go," he whispered. "Just go." He threw the bird into the air. Cher Ami climbed. The Germans saw him. The air filled with lead. Bullets zipped and cracked around the small creature. Suddenly, the bird faltered. Feathers exploded from its breast. It tumbled through the air, hitting the ground. The men in the trench groaned. It was over. But then, in the mud, a small pair of wings began to beat. Cher Ami hopped. He flapped once, twice, struggling against gravity and pain, and then he rose. Blood dripped from his breast. One leg hung by a single tendon. One of his eyes had been shot out. But the bird flew. He flew straight through the wall of bullets, climbing higher and higher until he was a speck against the gray sky. 25 minutes later, the American artillery stopped. The silence that followed was louder than the explosions. The smoke drifted lazily through the shattered trees. The men looked at each other, deafened, bleeding, but alive. But the Germans were frustrated. They had starved them, shot them, and watched them be bombed by their own side. Yet the Americans wouldn't die. On the 4th morning, a German soldier walked out under a white flag. He carried a letter. Whittlesey took the letter. It was typed in perfect English. "The suffering of your wounded men can be heard over here in the German lines," it read. "We appeal to your sentiments of humanity. Surrender. You are surrounded. There is no hope." Whittlesey read it. He folded it. He looked at the white sheets the Americans had placed on the ground to signal aircraft. "Pull those panels in," Whittlesey ordered. "Sir?" "Pull them in. We don't want them to think we are surrendering." "What about the reply, Major?" the German messenger asked. Whittlesey looked at the man. His uniform was tattered. He hadn't eaten in 4 days. He was a lawyer who hated war. but in that moment, he was iron. "You have your reply," he said. "Get off my line." He turned to his men. They were watching him. Gaunt faces, hollow eyes, bandages made of torn shirts. "Check your ammunition," Whittlesey said. "They're coming." And they did come. The Germans launched a final desperate attack with flamethrowers and grenades. They stormed the ravine, sensing the end. But the 308th and the remnants of the 307th fought like demons. They had no food. They had almost no bullets. They fought with bayonets, with shovels, with fists. They fought because they had nothing left to lose but their brothers next to them. One private, bleeding from the neck, swung his empty rifle like a club. "Not here!" he screamed. "You don't take us here!" They pushed the Germans back. Again. And again. By the 5th day, they were eating leaves. They took bandages off the dead to wrap the living. And then a sound. Not the crack of a German Mauser, not the heavy thud of a mortar, a shout. In English, "Hang on, we're coming through." On the ridge to the right, a shape appeared. Then another. American helmets. The relief force had finally broken the German line. They swarmed down the ravine, flushing the Germans out, closing the trap that had been open for 5 days. The relief soldiers ran toward the foxholes. They carried food, water, medical kits. But when they reached the bottom of the ravine, they slowed down. They stopped cheering. The scene before them was not a victory parade. It was a graveyard that breathed. Whittlesey stood up from his hole. He brushed the dirt from his uniform. He tightened his belt. He walked toward the relieving general. There were tears in the general's eyes as he looked around. Bodies were stacked like cordwood. The smell was unbearable. Whittlesey saluted. His hand didn't tremble. "Major Whittlesey," the general said softly. "I'm glad to see you." "We're still here, sir," Whittlesey replied. The numbers were grim. 554 men had walked into that ravine. Only 194 walked out. They marched out together. The ones who couldn't walk were carried. No one was left behind, not even the dead. Whittlesey was instantly hailed as a national hero. He was given the Medal of Honor. He was paraded through cities. But the lawyer from New York never smiled in the photographs. He attended the funerals of his men. He visited the mothers of the boys who died in the dark of the Argonne. He gave them his time, his money, and his soul. 3 years later, in 1921, Charles Whittlesey booked a passage on a steamship to Havana. On the first night of the voyage, he dined with the captain. He was polite. He was calm. After dinner, he walked to the rail of the ship. The ocean was dark, just like the forest. He stepped over the rail and vanished into the water. War creates heroes. We build statues for them. We write movies about them. But war also creates shadows that never fade, no matter how bright the medals shine. Major Whittlesey survived the German army. He survived the friendly fire. He survived the hunger. But he could not survive the memory of the men he led into the ravine. Cher Ami, the pigeon, became a hero, too. Army medics saved his life. They carved a tiny wooden leg to replace the one he lost. He died a year later, a symbol of hope. But the true weight of that week in October was carried by the man who refused to surrender, even as his heart was breaking with every order he gave. According to the official U.S. Army report, the stand of the Lost Battalion tied up so many German troops that it allowed the Allied forces to break the line and end the war weeks earlier. Historians debate the tactics. They debate the orders, but no one debates the courage. In the end, they were just men. Shopkeepers, laborers, lawyers, Americans. Abandoned in the dark, they found the only light that mattered: each other.